this going. And I'm going to make you a co-host just in case something happens to me.
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah, no worries.
And I will make a bunch of new co-hosts actually, because you never know where I'm at. We lose power every now and then lately. Ever
Oh,
since this last storm drove through.
yeah, I've had adventures over the years. We're in Austria traveling, and I had the silly idea of doing a webinar while I was there. And then midway through, the internet went out at the hotel we were at.
Oh boy.
It's like, all right.
Yeah. That. I worry about that all the time, almost to the point that I do have a second internet provider, but I have a volunteer group that I'm working with, and they need that unit for what we do, and so I don't have it here at my place anymore.
Yeah, I mean, in a pinch, I can use my phone as a hotspot, but
yeah.
You
But
know.
boy, that drains the phone down really quick.
Yeah, it does. I mean, thankfully, things have gotten to be pretty reliable as long as the power stays on.
Yeah. Yeah, and I have battery backup here, so it would keeps me going for about 20 minutes, half an hour, but
right.
That's about it. And they're still sort of recharging from my storm where I was out for 13 hours. So.
Oh, well.
Yeah. My one guy that helps me with this stuff is had to work today, so he's got a rodeo next weekend. So his boss said, "Yeah, you can work on Saturday if you want the rodeo to work on next Saturday." So
right.
I'm trying to do everything here. Good. All right. And all right, well, let's get started. Thanks everybody for coming today to the Digital Forum on a nice sunny August day. It's hard to believe we're this far into August, that we've got school starting in another week or two, and fall's coming. So we'll get started right away, because I know everybody's more excited to listen to Tim talk than to me. So Tim Gray is a highly respected educator in photography and digital imaging, offering clear guidance on complex subjects through his writings and speaking. Tim has written 18 books on a variety of subjects related to photography, has published over 200 training courses, and has hundreds of articles published in magazines such as Digital Photo Pro, Outdoor Photographer, among others. For more than 24 years, Tim has answered questions from photographers in his daily Ask Tim Gray newsletter, e-newsletter, we should say. He teaches through hands-on workshops, presents at a variety of events around the world. You can learn more about Tim's various projects at timgrayphoto.com. I've been a subscriber to his e-newsletter for a long, long time. He's helped me on so many Photoshop and Lightroom questions over the years, and it's great to be able to have him here. He's sponsored today by Gary from Hunt's Photo and Video. So want to always thank Gary at Hunt's. He's really been great at helping me get speakers for the digital forum. Thought maybe he'd be on here today, but he's probably busy on a Saturday morning, and he may pop in and we'll talk about Hunt's a little more. But if you need good photo equipment, Hunt's Photo and Video is a great place to get it. So with that, Tim, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Jeffrey. I appreciate you guys having me, and appreciate Gary at Hunt's. Always fun reaching out to him and seeing what's going on in the world of photo and what kind of great deals he's offering, perhaps more importantly. So definitely, if you've got something on your wish list, reach out to Hunt's or to Gary. It's funny because now things have transitioned so much to virtual presentations. But Gary, for so many years, was just an absolute fixture at every single photo event you could imagine, and he's done a good job of transitioning that to virtual. So thank him for helping to coordinate the presentation. Happy to be here. I'll go ahead and share my screen here, and we can get started talking about composition in photography. Which, there's one of the things that's really, really interesting to me overall in terms of photography is that it's this mix, this blend of both technical and creative. And when it started shifting to digital, so for those of us who have been around photography for a very long time and remember the days of film, there was that transition where suddenly it was a lot more technical knowledge that we needed to have. And the challenge with that is that I saw a lot of photographers sort of ignoring composition, ignoring the creative side of photography. And I've seen this kind of go back and forth as there's new developments in photography. A lot of times, that will change where there's a little bit more emphasis on either the technical aspects, the camera gear, other tools, or the post-processing. And, every now and then there's a resurgence of interest in composition, which I'm always grateful for, because to me, it is absolutely the most important aspect of photography. Yeah, you want to have really, really expensive and wonderful camera gear. That's just an endorsement, so you can tell your significant other that you do need to go out and buy more gear. Always encouraged. But I mean, the gear is important, obviously, and how we use those tools and get our exposure right. But really, ultimately, the most important thing in photography is the composition. And then, of course, the final presentation. So there's an element of the optimization process being really important. But, composition is really something that I think is important to focus on. So I won't talk much about myself because we already got that introduction. But, obviously I'm an avid photographer and an educator. And so I'm very passionate about, well, number one, learning as much as I can about everything related to photography, and then sharing that with others. And so a couple of things I will mention just briefly, not to turn this into an advertisement, but a couple of things that you might be interested in, especially if you actually enjoy the presentation today. So I have a relatively new series. It's been going on for a few months now. That is the Ultimate Live Learning Series, right now focused on Lightroom Classic and Photoshop. So generally a presentation each week on one of the, presentation on Lightroom Classic, presentation on Photoshop, live streaming similar to the presentation today. And then, of course, recordings of all those go into a library that you can get access to. And all that's exclusive for my Gray Learning Ultimate Bundle subscribers. So if you're at all interested, you can learn more on the Gray Learning website. And if you use this link, timgray.me/go live, that'll redirect with a coupon applied automatically. And so if you think you're even remotely interested, then you might want to make note of that link so that you can be sure to take advantage of the discount, or reach out to me via email and I can answer any questions. And then also coming up very soon, in just, what is that, about 3 weeks now, give or take, September 14th to 18th, I'm presenting once again as part of the Photoshop Virtual Summit. And this one's going to be pretty unique in that it is focused on projects. So each of the instructors, I'll be teaching 2 classes. They're all project-based, meaning that we're kind of going start to finish working on images, and we'll share all of the assets, all of the images that we use as part of those presentations. And so definitely worth checking out, timgray.me/project Photoshop. You can sign up for a free pass. So throughout the full 5 days, there's, I think, 40 some odd presentations that you can watch free of charge. There is an upgrade to a VIP pass to get lifetime access. class notes from instructors and some other bonus content. So just a couple things that I wanted to mention in case you are interested in learning more from yours truly. And in the case of Project Photoshop, for the Photoshop Virtual Summit, a number of other instructors as well. All right, so let's dive in and talk about composition, a topic that, as you might have gathered, is something I'm very passionate about. And one of the philosophies that I try to keep in mind always when it comes to photography and capturing great images, producing interesting images, is that my best photo has not yet been captured. That I have, my current favorite, you might say, what I might think of, well, I was going to say as my best photo, but really for me, it's more about which photo I like the most. But that there's still more out there. There's still more experiences I want to have, places I want to see, and photographs that I want to capture as part of that. And part of the reason I like to keep that in mind is that, trying not to feel like photography has become, an old habit or something, or that it's not as exciting as it once was, and trying to always find new and interesting ways of looking at the world around us and capturing images of those. This, by the way, was at one time my best photo. Don't worry if you're not impressed, because this was captured when I was in high school a few years or so ago with film, a black and white photography class that I took in high school. And, at the time I was actually, part of the reason that I took this picture was the sun glinting through the oak trees in the mountains, or hills anyway, of Southern California. And I didn't even know until after I made a contact sheet that there were clouds in the distance. And so not only is this perhaps my first favorite photo, it was the first photo that taught me the importance of really learning more and paying more attention in photography. There's no excuse for me to not have noticed those clouds. In fact, if I had noticed those clouds, I might have waited till just this moment, or set up the angle at just this position so that those clouds kind of tuck in nicely underneath that branch of the tree. So not a creative masterpiece, but a photo that, I cherish as a good memory from the very earliest days of my photography, and that taught me some great lessons about photography in the process. One of the things that I always strongly recommend, and to do as much as possible, there's a caveat here, but compose without the camera. Even if you don't have a camera with you, to constantly be kind of observing, and if you see something that catches your eye, that's interesting, to contemplate, even if just briefly, how might I frame up that subject? How would I go about photographing it? Where would I photograph it from? What position? Maybe how would I zoom in? What sort of lens might I use, etc. And the caveat is this can be frustrating because, for example, when I was living in New York City, we would, obviously be walking around a lot. It's a walking city, and especially at late afternoon, the light starts to hit the buildings and just create really nice textures of light and shadow. And I would practice what I'm preaching here. I would actually think about the composition, how I would frame things up, but then I would be frustrated that I didn't have a camera with me. Fortunately, nowadays there's really no excuse for that, right? Because we've got a smartphone with us, I'm sure pretty much every time we're out and about in the world. And so at the very least, you can capture a smartphone photo of, whatever catches your eye. But the point is to really practice, composition, to practice with your eyes, thinking about, how might you frame up a particular scene. This photo happens to be captured off the coast of the island of Capri in Italy. We were on a little tiny boat that we had rented. And, of course, the island of Capri itself is really beautiful, but then the way the reflections were catching on the water around us, pulled my attention away from the beautiful island, essentially. And so, looking for photos in unexpected places, or kind of having that experience available to your creative efforts, essentially. And then, one of the other issues that I find a lot of photographers run into, I talk about this a lot, where when a photographer sees something that they think is eye-catching, that's beautiful, that they want to photograph, there's this tendency to stop and take out their camera and capture a photo. And the problem with that is that they've stopped in the position where they just happened to be when they first set eyes on the subject. And they pull that camera up to eye height, or if they're using a tripod, they go to tripod height. And so it's sort of formulaic in the sense that here I've seen something, here I am. And so I'm just going to take the picture from where I am, maybe with a zoom lens, but I really encourage you to, anytime something catches your eye, to stop and think, how can I better photograph the subject? So this, you might be familiar with, this is in Bilbao, Spain, and we were walking to make our way toward the Guggenheim building here. And so this is taken from a bridge crossing over the river, and perfectly interesting building and a, interesting scene, etc. But that was just, where I first caught view of the building. That doesn't necessarily make it the best place to photograph the building. And so, going and trying to find a different vantage point. For me, a vantage point with fewer people in the frame is often a goal. Not that that's always the right answer, but it's, one of the things that I tend toward. But then really considering the subject, why am I photographing this building, essentially? Hopefully the answer is not, well, we're in Bilbao, Spain. It's the Guggenheim, so we have to photograph it. It's one of the top tourist attractions. I need a better answer than that, right? And it's an interesting building. Frank Gehry, of course, designs these buildings, or designed buildings with these sweeping lines, just really interesting structures. And so thinking about what's most important about the building, or what's most unique about the building. And for me personally, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but for me, there's a tendency to want to distill a scene down to its kind of bare minimum. And I'll give you various examples of that. But then to me, it's about the details of the building. And so zeroing in on a small portion of the building, something that sort of distills down, it's an iconic representation of what that building is all about. And so, trying to be thoughtful about what can I do to best capture, sort of the essence or the mood, whatever the case might be, obviously depending on the nature of the subject and why you're capturing the photo. And the point is to really be thoughtful, to stop and think, and to not just capture, at eye level. Can I get down lower? Can I move over to one side? Should I zoom in? Should I zoom out? Can I get higher, a much higher vantage point up on a rooftop or something like that? And, to really think about how I can frame up that subject. Because composition does get stronger with practice, with exercise. And, one of my favorite examples is out in the Palouse region of Eastern Washington. We would coordinate with crop dusters. And, when I would lead workshops and tell photographers, all right, we're going to go out and try and photograph crop dusters, often the answer was, why? Why would we bother doing that? And then we would get out there and see the plane. And this is actually a photo of a crop duster at very high altitude. There's times where his wheels are literally scraping against the crops that he's spraying. And so as soon as they have the experience, now they can't get enough of it. But the plane's moving pretty quick. And so you don't have a lot of time to, plan and to compose. A lot of it is sort of reactive. And so, it takes practice, but practicing to, where do I want to position the subject in the frame? What do I need to watch out for? With a low-flying airplane, if you can get the shadow in the frame, that's adds a nice little element. And, if you can have him fly a yellow airplane over a yellow field, or, get lucky and he happens to need to spray canola that day. But, the point is that the more you practice, so if you go out, I'm sure many of you have done birds in flight photography, for example. Among what can be the most frustrating and challenging types of photography, but also the most rewarding. But you come away with what, like 10,000 photos of a single species of bird, and then you cull that down to like 2 photos that you're really happy with. But it takes that practice, and the more challenging, the faster moving the subject, the more practice it might take. But it really can improve, and you can get faster and more fluid with your compositions if you practice. If you're always just looking at a scene and thinking about what can make this a more impactful or stronger composition, you'll get quicker at that as well. I've had photographers who say, wow, we pull up at a scene and you go just to the right spot, and I'm wandering all over the place. And it's nothing, it's no magic. It's just practice. By spending a lot of time, every time you're in a scene that you want to photograph, just looking at the overall scene and figuring out what sort of angles might look good if I move over here or over there, etc. you do get faster with it, where you don't need to take as much time. Not that I don't encourage you to take as much time as you need or want or have available, but the point is that you can start getting faster at creating those compositions quickly. And sometimes it's easy. It's a lion. So you sit there with a nice long lens. You've got to zoom in. So, the general rule is zoom with your feet. With lions, I usually recommend using a lens instead. But, so at a safe distance with, I think this was, I think it was a 300 millimeter lens, but with a 2x teleextender. And so a 600 millimeter effective focal length in a vehicle, safe distance, frame it up, compose and wait, as we say. Frame it up and wait for the lion to yawn. And, so we were sitting there, and there's probably a half dozen of us in this vehicle. And, every now and then you'd hear the cameras, click, because, we're bored and we need to take some pictures every now and then, or we'll atrophy. And then the lion starts to yawn, and then it's suddenly this just, cacophony of shutters going off at high speed. But the composition, the framing is pretty straightforward. We want the lion in the frame. I'll talk about some of the details here a little bit later with some different examples. But, sometimes it's really straightforward. And other times, it's maybe a little bit more of a challenge or a little bit more thought that needs to go into it. And that's where, these rules of composition that I'm sure we're all familiar with can be helpful. They also, I feel have a tendency to oversimplify. And, so like the rule of thirds. Sure, I can put the horizon at the third line, but why? Nobody's going out to my photo with a ruler and measuring to see if the horizon is at the 1/3 mark. So, to me, what is it really talking about when we talk about rule of thirds? And there's two basic things that I would say are involved here. Number one is to not bullseye. So I don't want the subject right at the dead center. We usually like to have that subject offset a little bit. There's a tendency, after all, there is, in many cases, we have a bullseye right in the viewfinder, encouraging us to put the key subject right at the center of the frame. But, we usually want to have that subject offset so that it looks more composed, it looks more intentional. And sometimes at first glance we say, oh, well, the subject is at the dead center. Yeah, but there's various things that affect what I refer to as the overall balance within the photo. So, sometimes having the subject right dead center works perfectly great. And so as with all rules in photography, all rules in any creative pursuit, they're there to be broken. They provide us with some good guidelines, some general guidelines, but they're just that. They're just a starting point. And then you need to decide, well, what really works for the frame. And the way I generally think about this overall concept of not just centering up our subject or using the rule of thirds is to strike a balance. And so, and this takes on a few different things. Overall balance within the frame, so sort of the weight within the frame. There's also an element of what are we emphasizing? And so here, for example, I could have put the horizon down toward the bottom 1/3 of the frame, but now it's just a whole lot of open sky. Granted, with some nice color, but not a lot of texture, not a lot of interest going on in that sky other than the color and the sun. Whereas the area down below is more interesting. So, when it comes to a horizon, what I say is we don't want the horizon most of the time right at the center of the frame. Sometimes that gives us great symmetry that works wonderfully well. But as a general rule, we'd want the horizon either higher in the frame or lower in the frame. Doesn't have to be a third. That's just kind of a rough guideline, a rough starting point. It really means that we don't want the horizon most of the time to be centered. And so now how do we decide which way to go? Pretty simple. Probably you already know when you're looking at the scene. What's more interesting, the foreground or the sky, so to speak? And so here the textures of the foreground, I think, are a little bit more interesting than seeing more of the sky. And so that makes it pretty easy to make that decision. And also the balance, sort of the weight balance. Notice how the sun kind of fits into this nook of the shape of the hills there. The sun is over in the lower part of the hill rather than the higher part of the hill on the left. Part of that is where I happen to be standing, but that's the reason that I happen to be standing there, is that it provided this perspective where the sun goes into this little nook, essentially. But having, this balance, again, it doesn't need to be exactly 1/3, but where we've got variations in weight. So here we've got, more texture, more weight, you might say, on the left side, or not as clean on the left side versus cleaner on the right side. And so that just creates this interesting balance of these textures. Sometimes, though, that balance is more like right down the middle of the frame. Here it's a little nuanced because of the shapes involved, but we've got the whitewater versus the still water, so to speak, and they're just divided. This sort of creates this kind of yin yang sort of a shape almost, and so it just made sense. It wasn't that the whitewater was more important than the darker area. They sort of were equal in a lot of respects, and the contrast between them is what makes the overall scene, I think, interesting. This old farmhouse at Sunrise, and you know, my first instinct was to put the sun right up against, or right adjacent to the house. But then I thought, especially with the sweeping line of the hill that goes off toward the left there, that having the sun set over there farther to the left of the frame gave a little bit more balance, a little bit more interest, where we've, think almost like a teeter-totter, like a seesaw, where, or scales, where we're trying to balance things out. And so there's the interest on both sides, the sun versus the farmhouse, but then they work together. And even though they're spread out, they're on opposite sides of the frame, but to me, it creates an interesting balance. It also creates interest in terms of different areas of the image to explore as a viewer. And so, I'd started off uh, thinking fast, because once the sun gets to the horizon, it's amazing how fast it seems to rise up. But I started off further over to the right so that the sun was juxtaposed closer to the house. And it just didn't feel right, didn't feel like the right position. And so I shifted over to get these elements spread out a little bit further. Uh, you know, I think a good example of, I could have put that Space Needle anywhere in the frame. And I suppose it could be argued that anywhere in the frame could have worked, that it could be centered, it could be high, low, left, right. Probably doesn't matter. Part of what makes it, to me at least, interesting is the isolation. It's the Space Needle all by itself. Usually the Space Needle is seen. In fact, I'll have another example of the Space Needle a little bit later. But normally, the Space Needle is in amongst a bunch of other buildings because it is. But, and I mean this literally, a rare moment of fog in Seattle, which everybody thinks I'm joking that because it's always foggy. It's actually not foggy very often. It's always cloudy, it seems like, in Seattle. It's almost always overcast, but fog is not super common. And so to me, it was like this special moment of, oh, wow, this is not something we normally see. And it's pretty rare to see the Space Needle without any of the buildings around it really all that visible. And, so that worked. And I guess I just chose randomly almost. It could have been, left or right. And it just felt like it fit over on the right side for whatever reason. Maybe it's just because I'm right-handed. I don't know. But the point is that deliberately positioning it somewhere in the frame. And that's deliberate is one of the most important, I think, keywords in photography. I'm sure I'll use it more than once as I continue talking here, where it's an important element of composition, is that you're being deliberate and that it seems deliberate. More on that a little bit later. Um, so I waited, no, I got lucky that these two hot air balloons happened to line up. This is at the Albuquerque Balloon Fiesta. Uh, I talked about birds in flight being challenging. This is right up with that. I know if you haven't been there, it probably doesn't seem like it, because hot air balloons do not move very fast, but it's amazing how quickly they drift in and out of the position you want them in. And so you really got to pay attention. There's, dozens of balloons in the sky, and I've got to find, what interesting little combinations are out there. And, you frame this up, and then by the time you take the picture, they're starting to drift. Probably a few moments later, the balloon that's closer, that over on the right-hand side there, probably drifted over and hid the other one from view, or they spread further apart. And so again, needing to be quick, which is where that practice comes in, but having a little bit of a balance where there's, a larger object and a smaller object, so to speak, or, juxtaposition, which I'll get into in more detail a little bit later. But, this balance between these different elements of the frame. In this case, creating sort of something of an abstract image. If you're not familiar with the subject, it probably looks like a really, weird, odd composition. Like maybe it's AI or something, but this happens to be if you know the Pantheon in Rome, and there it's a dome and it's got a hole. It literally is a skylight up there, so that when it rains, the water comes right inside. There's holes in the floor to drain the water out. And early in the morning or late in the afternoon, in this case happens to be afternoon, as the sun gets lower, then the sunlight shining through the hole starts to work its way up through the dome. And so I thought this created an interesting juxtaposition of, again, that balance where we've got these two objects on opposite sides of the photo. Another thing that I try to keep an eye out for and leverage and use whenever I possibly can is leading lines. And, the classic leading line would be like a stream in the foreground that leads to, the mill house in the background or something like that, where there's this really obvious line. There's, a path or a roadway that, you position part of it, it enters the frame at the bottom left corner, for example, and then it winds its way up into the middle of the image. It doesn't have to be that obvious, right? It can be just some little hint of something that guides your eye up in. And, we have a tendency to follow lines, to follow paths through the photo. And so with this image, for example, obviously an old truck and this, narrow composition, tight composition. And then I noticed with the seam on the hood that, if I'm over on one side, because you can imagine, I took more than a few photos of this old truck, different angles and different perspectives. And then I realized, if I get over a little bit to the left of this seam, then it can form a diagonal through the frame and creates this leading line that just kind of helps guide us up toward, the windshield and the rearview mirror and the steering wheel. In other cases where maybe it's not exactly a leading line, but it's a similar concept where it creates these interesting geometric juxtapositions in the image. This actually, funny enough, this was in Busan, South Korea, and I was teaching on board a cruise ship. So we arrived in the morning. Well, somebody saw my post on social media indicating that I was going to be in Busan, I think the next day or 2 days later. And they said, "Oh, you should reach out to my friends. They're locals and they can give you, and they're photographers and they can give you a little bit of a tour." And so I met up with them and got a great tour. And they asked what time we were leaving. And I told them what time it was. And they said, "Oh, that's too bad. You're going to be leaving before the bridge lights up." Well, I didn't even know that the bridge did light up. And more so that it's got a really colorful, constantly changing colorful light show. Fortunately, we ended up departing late and I had that little tip. And so I was out on the deck ready when we passed underneath so that I could let the bridge form this leading line, essentially. Usually leading lines we think of as coming from the bottom corners, in this case, coming up from, basically the top corner, as it were, but just to kind of guide us into the main structure of the bridge. And, it's funny because you see the bridge during the daytime and it's an interesting bridge, but there's a lot of clutter around it. Nighttime helps to mask some of that clutter off in the background. Another sort of feature that works well, and this kind of ties in a little bit with leading lines, of course, is diagonals. And there's just something about diagonals that add an interesting aesthetic quality to an image, makes a little bit more visual interest. And so, here, for example, on the streets of New York City and looking up at a fire escape and set against, the clear blue sky. And, of course, my natural, and I'm sure some of you have the same inclination, natural inclination was to kind of like make the line straight, essentially to have, like almost a horizon formed by some of those bars. But as is often the case, I'll get lines lined up and then realize, oh, wait, I should tilt this a little bit to get a more interesting composition. And so, sort of forcing diagonals into a scene that, it's really not, there's a bunch of parallel and perpendicular lines, not diagonals really, until you rotate the camera to create the angles yourself. And just watching for, subjects out there where, it doesn't have to be this dramatic from one corner to the other sort of diagonal. Just even, these prayer sticks that are just, leaned up against a fence. And so they kind of create their own little angle and symmetry and texture. And so, I find that angle just works nicely. Whereas it'd be, to me, a lot less interesting if these were just stacked perfectly vertically against, a wall where I'm now, having them all lined up and it's still symmetrical, but I think a little bit less interesting. Another, I'm sure I've used the word more than once, and I'm sure I'll use it again, but another of my favorite words in photography is juxtaposition. So trying to find ways to position more than one subject. And, this, in this particular case, in many cases, it ties into the notion of compose and wait. So, this is in Italy, on the eastern shore, and found this little vineyard, and the grapes just looked so beautiful. So I'm wandering around looking for good bunches of grapes to photograph. Well, there's also bees, flitting about. And so I found a little bunch of grapes that I liked, and waited and waited and waited with my fingers crossed. And finally a bee flies in. And it's interesting sometimes, if I had this picture without the bee and you ask me where did I want it, that's probably right about where I would have put it. Now, I guess I can take a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of credit for number one, framing up the subject, and two, pushing the shutter release when I did. But really, it was the bee that created the juxtaposition in this particular case. And so, again, when we can have elements within the frame that are in interesting positions relative to each other, that works out very nicely. And again, always paying attention. So this is in the Palouse region of Eastern Washington State, where for probably 12 years I'd run photo workshops out there. And so we're driving around in a van, visiting, obviously specific locations, but then in between, keeping your eyes open for anything that might arise. And looking for juxtapositions is one of those things that we want to keep an eye on. And so this windmill up on top of the hill that I'd driven by countless times, and in fact, we had photographed this earlier. You might be able to tell there in the shadow that it's a canola crop, a blanket of yellow flowers there. But then I saw the clouds up in the sky above, and I thought, okay, this has some potential. And so we pulled over. I'm confident that half the time when I spot something and just pull over, that there's confusion on the part of the workshop participants, wondering why did we stop and what are we supposed to photograph? But then looking at this scene and thinking about how can we best capture this. So I got up on a little bit higher vantage point and waited for those clouds to adjust just a little bit, to shift just a little bit, and then used a really long lens because all I wanted was the juxtaposition of the windmill against these nice cumulus clouds. And so that was the result. And so, not a huge difference, well, conceptually. If I just describe these photos without showing them to you, you'd say, okay, yeah, sounds pretty similar. But it's that juxtaposition that I think makes for a more interesting image, and the balance. Notice how the windmill is tucked right below this little bulge in the cloud so that it feels like it fits in its little nook, right? And so obviously, it's not like I'm just going to wait and hope that this type of situation happens, but I'm paying attention to those clouds, and I'm still taking pictures because that's what we do. Get the insurance shot, for example. But then when I see that there's this little bulge in the cloud that's drifting toward, realizing that that's going to make a more interesting juxtaposition. So capturing that frame as well, and that ends up being my favorite from that subject in any event, at least from that circumstance. And then, one of the other things I personally have a tendency to do a lot. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But to consider what I call non-standard framing, meaning there's the framing that is sort of the default that just about anybody would think of. Surprise, we've got a wheat field that's backlit right about sunset. The sun's just about to go behind the hill. And so I've put the sun up toward the top of the frame, sort of following the rule of thirds more or less, with the horizon up near the top so that I can get that backlit wheat in the foreground. But what about leaving the sun out of the frame? It might sound like a silly idea, because that would remove the sunset element. But what if we did that? And so I did do that, and I think it's a more interesting photo. We still have the impression of the sun. We still have the God rays coming in, and we've still got the backlit wheat. But to me, it's a little bit more of a simple photo. and in terms of the composition. And it's not quite necessarily what I would think of as like the more logical framing. At sunset, we usually include the sun in the frame, or at least we very often include the sun in the frame. But think about ways that, we can kind of ignore that standard approach, or more to the point, still take that photo, but then experiment with different possibilities to see if you can come up with a more interesting, more unique photo, a little maybe more eye-catching, a little more compelling, for example. And then, one of the other elements, so this is kind of tied into the rule of thirds, at least I think of it as a corollary rule with the rule of thirds, is if we're going to position a subject on one side of the frame or the other, we need to think about which side. And one of the kind of guidelines that I talk about in this context is giving the object, whatever it might be, space to look or to move. So here we have another crop duster. It is moving, so it needs room to move. So I want space in front of the crop duster so that it has room to move. Otherwise, it looks awkward, or it can look awkward. And so we want to give that object, in this case the airplane, room to move. And similarly, bird in flight, I want more space in front of the bird than behind the bird so it has room to move or room to look. It holds true for inanimate objects. Okay, well, this one, it seems animated because it's a little character, but there's space for it to look. There's room for it to look over to the left-hand side. Since the character is looking to our left, we want space in front of him so that he has room to look. Otherwise, it seems awkward. Or I guess in this case, we say we want to know that if he throws that penny, it's not going to just bounce off the edge of the frame. We want it to have some room to fly through the air. And further anthropomorphizing, I suppose, we want this barn to have some room to look. And so, if we imagine that this barn could move or could look, which way would it move or look? I'm guessing toward the right, because this is the front of the barn, or the face of the barn, as it were. And so we want more room over on the right than on the left side. But we can break that rule. And so, here, well, I suppose this is the before version, but I suppose you could say, well, this is kind of bullseyed more or less. Does it have more room in the front? Nah, not quite. So I guess maybe it broke the rule a little bit because there's equal space behind. But I was actually struggling with this little scene, and this is down at Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge down in Florida, and a beautiful, beautiful morning light, and we had these various birds, primarily snowy egrets, that had this very predictable behavior. They were fishing over in one little corner, then they would fly off to the left. And where they were doing their fishing, they were in the shade. It didn't look very good. But once they got out of that shade into the sunlight, it looked rather wonderful. But I was struggling with the framing. I was trying too hard to follow the rules, ultimately. I guess is the best way to describe it. And so I decided it was time to break the rules. And so I did so. And so I did not allow room for the bird to look or move. It's about to run right into the edge of the frame, or obviously more to the point, fly out of the frame. But I felt that it was more important to have this balance where we've got also the ripples in the water that he had just disturbed. And so wanting to incorporate that entire frame, and that's what I had been struggling with so much, is trying to keep the bird over on the right-hand side of the frame in this case, but it just wasn't working. And I think this worked very nicely, even though it breaks that rule, which again is a corollary to the rule of thirds, to have the room for that subject to look or to move. Another example of breaking that, this is in Venice, Italy, of course. And I was fascinated by these boats coming through the tunnels, usually at really high speed, not worrying about any intersecting traffic or anything. They would just come flying through. And, if I want to allow room for the person or the boat to move or to look, I've got to widen out that frame quite a bit. And now there's just a whole lot more clutter. There's people up on top of the bridge, and there's buildings adjacent to, and other boats, that are parked along the side of the intersecting canal. And so it was just a lot less interesting. But if you allow yourself to break that rule, to let that boat be cut off, to let the person be looking out of the frame rather than into the frame, and paying attention. Notice over on the left-hand side that arch of the bridge is forming, to some extent, you might say it's a leading line, especially with the reflection, but more to the point that it's actually in the frame. And so I was being very careful about how I wanted to frame up the scene, but I was allowing myself to break that rule about that subject looking or moving essentially out of the frame. A more exaggerated or extreme version of this is here. This is the Nathan's famous hot dog stand sign in Coney Island in New York. And this was another example of compose and wait. Got myself set up and I was just waiting for interesting people to walk through the frame. And this woman wearing, green pants seemed to fit in perfectly with the Nathan's logo. And, in general, with this particular arrangement, you would think, well, I want the people entering the frame over on the right-hand side as opposed to exiting the frame. But I just felt like it was more interesting that they're leaving and that, we're left here with the sign. And so it does, creates this element of, of tension, essentially, of, they're about to break out of the frame, but it also creates this curiosity, or tends to create curiosity in the part of the viewer. It's like, well, where are they heading off to? What's next for them? After their hot dogs, maybe they're going for a ride in Coney Island at the park there. So, breaking the rule can certainly work very well. And in this case, I think it worked out nicely. At least I like to think so. I mentioned earlier, one of my tendencies in photography is to simplify. Admittedly, sometimes I do this too much. I'll talk about that a little bit. But I think, it's worth reminding yourself that you don't need to include everything in the frame. Or even everything interesting in the frame. So you might recognize this view from Piazzale Michelangelo in Florence, Italy, and it's a very common spot. It happens to be the location and the evening when I proposed to my wife, and she said yes. And of course, as a photographer, I had to risk having her change her mind by taking photographs to to commemorate the evening. And we had this pretty decent blue hour. It wasn't quite fully developed at this point, but again, sort of, the tendency is, oh, well, here's an interesting bell tower on that side, and then the Duomo on the other side, and the river in the foreground, and so, I've got to include all of this. But then, I consider what's really most important here. Do I need the other bell tower? Do I need the river? Do I need, all these different buildings and lights and everything else? What can I do to simplify this and distill it down to the more basic elements? And in many cases, not always, but I find that usually makes the photo more interesting. We think we need to include everything to tell the story, but really we might just need the main character or the most important component to give us a sense. And so thankfully, my soon-to-be wife was patient about it and allow me a little bit of time to find my composition. And so this is the image that I came away with, which she loves, by the way. So it all worked out well. But yeah, simplifying. And again, it's not always the right answer, but it can be a really good exercise in terms of improving a composition for a subject, creating a more interesting subject, or a more interesting photo of a subject, I should say. And so, especially with subjects that are photographed a lot, can you imagine how many pictures have been taken of the Duomo? This is several years in the making, because I tried it at sunrise and that didn't work quite as well, partially with the angles of the sun. I'd photographed this scene numerous times, but finally getting it at blue hour is what I think worked out the best, but then also distilling that scene down. But anytime, I've got a subject, and, I'll oftentimes approach a subject in this way where I feel like, why am I photographing this? This has been photographed so many times. There's no sense, every picture's been taken. There's no need for me to try and, capture, except I do want a picture that's my own. And so trying to think, especially with subjects that are fairly common, that are often photographed, is there something more interesting that I can do? And, if you're going to go to Seattle and photograph the Space Needle, you're probably going to go to Cary Park. At least that's where I would suggest that you go to get the classic skyline view. But if you're exploring around, there's all sorts of different angles you can find as well. So just trying to find something that's a little bit more interesting, off the beaten path, so to speak. And simplicity. I am a big fan of simplicity, so I recognize that's not for everybody. But this actually is on a road trip when I'd been living in Seattle. We were moving to New York City, and I decided, since I didn't need to be there right away, that I would take a road trip across the country. And this is outside of Salt Lake City, Utah. And one of the challenges of road trips is that you spot something and then you have to figure out how in the heck to get there and if you can even get there. And, when you get there, can you pull off on the side of the road? But fortunately, I found a nice vantage point. It was a really dreary sky, and it had snowed recently. And so the rooftop is covered in snow. That's at the bottom triangle there. And obviously the steeple is white with these dark windows, and it all just kind of, this the symmetry of the color, or I guess I should say the tones, the lack of color, I thought really worked nicely, was really interesting. Again, the rule of thirds, diagonals, to some extent, I guess you could say leading line, and the contrast. But really, to me, it was about simplicity. It was about distilling this down to just a very basic element in a very cluttered city of rooftops, essentially. This is also out in the Palouse. Unfortunately, this tree's not looking as good as it once did these days. But trying to kind of just find, if you're familiar with the Palouse, Steptoe Butte is just off to the right in the medium distance, and there's more hills off to the left. There's a dirt road to the left. I'm standing on another little dirt road. There's a lot of other things that I could have included in the frame, but to me, this was a picture of a tree, and I just wanted a little bit of context for the tree. So getting the wheat in the foreground, and then the hills going off in the distance, and the clouds, etc. But it really is a tree in its environment, and I wanted to maintain that look with as minimalist of composition as possible, or as was reasonable, I guess you could say. What is it? I don't know if it's accurate, but attributed to Einstein that everything should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. I guess that sort of sums up some of what I'm attempting in my photography. This was actually born of frustration. This is from the water at the Hubbard Glacier in Alaska, and I was really struggling. The conditions weren't great, and I was not getting great photos of the glacier. But then I looked over in the other direction, and there's these mountains, once again, similar to the church steeple there, that it's kind of a bland, dreary sky, but that dreariness kind of all worked well to kind of make everything kind of blend together. And so there's that symmetry of tones, and then obviously the juxtaposition of the two mountain peaks. And largely this was about just looking across this mountain range and finding what's more interesting. And there were these two little peaks juxtaposed near each other that I thought looked really nice. This, by the way, is with a 600 millimeter lens on a camera with a 1.6x cropping factor, and so just shy of 1,000 millimeter focal length. But sometimes it's that, or crop a lot after the fact. And so again, just simplifying. There's just mountain ranges and water and icebergs and a glacier, and there's so much going on all around me. But to me, my favorite photo of the day was distilling that down to just one little area, a tiny little fraction of the total area that I was able to see from that position. Similar, and this is something that I just stumbled upon. This is in Rome, Italy, near the Campo dei Fiori, and just wandering randomly. And let's go down this little narrow street. Spotted this door, and start getting set up, and took a picture. And then I hear, "Do you like my door?" I look, and somebody approaches, and I said, "Yes, I love this door." That got all these textures, paint that from various applications over the years, and rust and everything else. And he said, "You want to see what's inside?" And funny enough, he was an American college professor who was teaching in Italy at the time, and his classroom inside, just past this door, was full of just wildly interesting maps, and I love maps. So it was a double win, a door that I've returned to many times over the years to photograph, and the experience of getting to check out what was on the other side, which was always, well, in this case, it was fun and interesting. But it could have been scary, I guess. But again, the habit I have of kind of distilling things down. And so, anybody recognize this scene? That's a joke, of course, because well, actually, maybe somebody could recognize, not exactly, but the concept. This is in Venice, Italy, and where there's a lot of colorful buildings, often with the building is one color and the shutters on the windows are another contrasting color, and so it's all very interesting. But the reflections on the canal caught my eye, and I thought, This is really a distillation, abstract though it may be, a distillation of Venice, because we've got obviously water and reflections, which are a big part of, the charm of Venice, and then the colorful buildings, but then the reflections, and oftentimes I'm trying to include reflections in a photo, but in this case, the photo really is just the reflections. And so, I don't need everything else. Let me have just that little bit. The I don't need the entire balloon. Now, this gets to the point I mentioned being deliberate. If you're going to cut off part of a subject, which I'll talk about a little bit more shortly, it's gotta look deliberate. It cannot look like an accident. So, be careful about that. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But we don't need the entirety of that subject necessarily. And sometimes it's a lot more interesting that we've really filled the frame. In fact, not only did we fill the frame, we exceeded the frame with this single subject with complementary colors, of course. And, so I think it works very nicely. It's an interesting photo. But for me, the challenge is then I have a tendency to forget to capture the wide shots. So I tend to take a lot of detail photos. And then when somebody might ask, well, what was it really like to be there? I don't have that picture because I was so busy looking for the details. So it's important to have the establishing shots so you kind of convey what was it like to be there? What was that experience like, to give a better sense of that, and then share those detailed views. But the way I look at it, this might be a photo that I would show you, oh, there were a lot of balloons in the air, but this would be the image that I would say is more likely to get hung on the wall. And, so there's that distinction sort of between what I think of as the artistic shot versus the documentary shot. So, wide to show more of a sense of, what that view was like, what the scene was like, how immersive it was. So here we've got, this gentleman on horseback up on the hills of the sand dunes with the grasses all over them, and just making that subject more diminutive in the frame. There certainly is a photo zeroing in, zooming way in on just the horse, filling the frame with the horse and rider, for example. But as much as I favor those tighter shots, there's always room for the wide shot as well. And they certainly play a big role in photography. They're certainly interesting images that give us a sense of place or sense of experience. I mean, you can see this near sunset, and this rider, looking contemplative, like he's just there, kind of like mesmerized by the sunset, or meditating in late afternoon light, or whatever the case might be. So there's a strong sense of tranquility and mood here that would not have translated as well, I think, with a tighter shot. But then, also thinking about, what's the shot about? What's the story about? And, so here again, so I'd started off with a wider view, but this is a woman who is weaving hats, and, Panama hats, of course, which means we're in Ecuador, because that's where they're most famously made, despite the names. And so this is all about this woman out in the sun on this hot day, weaving by hand these hats. And so just trying to tell the story of the work that's involved without necessarily, you don't even need to know that this is going to be a hat. This is just the straw that she's working with her hands, and, the textures and tones and whatnot. But as a general rule, what I have a tendency to start with, I kind of start backwards. A lot of photographers probably start with that wider view, the establishing shot, and then try to simplify. I'm the one who has a tendency to start with the simplistic, and so start with just a key subject. And sometimes that's all I need. This is in Bologna, Italy, and I actually, funny enough, we were wandering around, we'd gotten lunch, and I was sort of feeling frustrated that I wasn't getting the photos that I thought I was going to get. And then I put my gaze upward to the windows and realized, there's scenes all over the place around me with the colorful buildings and colorful shutters, and, cutting off the city down below and getting, these interesting little kind of almost still life compositions. But, I'll start with the key subject, I'll find something and then contemplate, okay, what else do I need? What can I add to this frame? So, whether you start with more and then you distill it down, or you start with less and then you broaden it out, to contemplate, is there more? I mean, here we have a Moai statue at Rapa Nui, Easter Island, and there's other statues there in the background in the quarry. So, it makes it interesting enough. But finding, where can I juxtapose more than one of these statues, for example. And it's not difficult because it's sort of self-evident on the island here where the moais are, and they tend to be clustered. But again, we've got one subject, and now let's try and juxtapose more. And how do I position them in the frame? Paying attention to avoid awkward intersections. So notice that the primary moai on the far right, that there's space in front of it. It's not intersecting with any of the others. Whereas the secondary statues, it's okay that they're all intersecting with each other because they're just sort of supporting actors, as it were. So again, what can I add? Or the corollary to that would be, what can I subtract? This actually was one of my most rewarding, I guess, at least psychologically, experiences leading a photo workshop, because this is a 5-day workshop that I was leading in New York City, and the weather forecast was just terrible. And there's only so much you can do indoors. We've got to take photos outside. And so we had an afternoon that was going to just be full of thunderstorms. But I'm a kind of a nerd when it comes to the weather, so I studied and saw, around about sunset, it looks like these cells are going to be moving out of the area. So we went over and did a little bit of basic photography, and then as the rain was approaching, got dinner. I encouraged everybody to, have an extra glass of wine or a beer. We got dessert because we were killing time while it was just a torrential downpour outside, and watching the people who had not planned for the weather going by getting drenched. And once the rain was just about past, we moved down to a coffee shop. This is in Brooklyn, in the Dumbo neighborhood, and looking across to Lower Manhattan. And once the light started, the color started as the sun got closer to the horizon, getting this just glorious golden light. It was just absolutely amazing. And so we head outside, still raining very lightly, but it's clearing up. And then, contemplate, okay, here's the view, and the sky is remarkable. And so there's a lot that you could potentially include, but can we maybe distill that down? And so distilling it down to a tighter frame, but also, and I don't remember the exact timing, but the next photo I'm going to show you was taken on the same evening, probably something like a half an hour later, if that. And so we go from this light to this, with still wispy clouds, getting a little bit of that more pastel color, but just a tighter composition. We've got the carousel in the foreground at the bottom left as sort of a framing element, anchor element, I should say. And so kind of tightening up that composition just a little bit. Not necessarily too tightly. This is obviously a crop. This is the original. Part of the reason that I cropped it is to get rid of all that clutter over there on the left-hand side. But being careful. So, we like tight compositions in general, often work, obviously depending on the subject, but being careful not to be, when in doubt, leave a little bit of room for cropping, he said, as he showed you the frame where he did not leave enough room. Partly, flamingos don't move very fast, so they shouldn't be that challenging to photograph. But there was a group of them, this is in Cartagena, Colombia, and there was a group of these flamingos, and they're in partial shade. So really nice light is hitting some of them at any given time. And so I'm just going a mile a minute trying to find these compositions. And this is the best photo of that little session. And I was, now thankfully, AI can expand the frame for me very easily, right? But this is how it came out of the camera. And I was so frustrated because it's too tight. It needed some more room up there on the top. So, lesson learned. Now I have to go back to Colombia and look for flamingos again. But I mentioned earlier, cutting off a subject, and that it should be intentional, and it should look intentional, not awkward. So it's not, oops, I barely clipped the bird's wing just a little bit. I made a conscious decision that this is a head and shoulders shot, for example. I'm not a people photographer, but one of the rules of photographing people is that you don't cut them off at the joints. So you don't have somebody's knees at the edge of the frame or their hips at the edge of the frame. You'll go mid-thigh or, mid-torso or head and shoulders, that sort of a thing. And so it's one of those rules that's kind of hard to describe, because it really comes down to, don't make it look awkward. Well, how do I know? And the general way I describe that is, you don't want something that's just barely sticking into the frame, and you don't want something that is just barely sticking out of the frame. And so, here, for example, palm trees just after, or a palm tree just after sunset. And I could have included the whole tree, but to me now it starts to just look like this little tree lost in the sky versus tightening up, intentionally cutting off part of the tree so that it has just a little more dominant in the frame, essentially. I actually, I've always loved this photo in part. I guess it's a few things. It's in one of my favorite neighborhoods in Rome, Italy, the Trastevere neighborhood, and it's this little hidden nook, and there's like trash strewn all about in this little alleyway. So if you saw it, you wouldn't necessarily walk through it, but I did. And at the bottom of it was this really interesting door with the framing of the building, and funny enough, the drainage pipe on the side that kind of helps create an interesting balance, along with this foliage, like I don't know that it's actually ivy, but something along those lines that's kind of growing along. And it just, I don't know, it just stood out as a really interesting scene. And someone said, well, why did you cut off the door? Meaning the bottom portion of the door. And the honest answer is that there was a bunch of trash, like beer bottles and all sorts of other clutter and debris on the porch, and I didn't want to include that. But I think it works because it looks intentional. Or you can see that I was trying to leave something out of the frame, but but in this case it worked. And unfortunately, it won't work again because now this thing's covered with graffiti. The plants aren't there anymore. It really fell apart. But in any event, the point is that we can cut off subjects, just try to make sure that it looks intentional. And then framing, this is a common concept, of course, and I'll show you some more sort of stereotypical examples here in just a moment. But this notion of like just giving our subject a way to stand out. And so here's some backlit wheat, and there's always going to be the stalks that rise up a little bit higher. This is in the Palouse, which is really, really hilly, and so the wheat is backlit, but behind it there's another hill, and so that's already in shadow. And so if I can find a way to juxtapose the subject against the dark background, it gives me that framing. It helps to create a background where, again, in this case, the wheat stalks really stand out. But sometimes the framing can be intentional. And so this adorable horse, the first time I had gone by, I was like, oh, there's a horse in the doorway of the barn. And what amazing timing. This is perfect. Pull over and let's take this picture. Then I got to know Fallon, the horse, and the owners. And Fallon spends most of the day hanging out at the window, or at the door, I should say. So he's not there anymore, unfortunately. But it was a real year after year we'd stop by, and the only time you'd miss him is if he was inside dozing off, or if he'd gone around the back where his water was. But otherwise, he liked to hang out and watch the traffic go by. So literal framing. Sometimes you got to work for it a little bit. So this is at Bethesda Terrace in Central Park in New York City. And so there's acoustics in this covered area that musicians like to take advantage of. And so, there's various ways you can photograph them, but I like to try to find ways to kind of silhouette them in the frame of the archway there. Talk about being deliberate and distilling things down, but it's really important to also pay attention to the edges. Sometimes this is easier than others. Here, it was a little bit of a challenge. There's these different boats. This is in Jakarta, or near Jakarta anyway, Senegal, out at this lake where they harvest where they harvest salt, which is what these boats are used for. And, very colorful and interesting on their own. But, you've got these numbers and the word esprit, and but now I've got to make sure not to cut off any of the boats in an awkward, weird way, or have one of these, not exactly oars, but what amount to oars, barely sticking into the frame, or something just barely cut off. And, notice the numbers that have some space, the reflections of the numbers on the water. And so just like trying to constantly readjust that framing so that it's got this nice balance and symmetry, and I'm not making any awkward cutting off of areas. Yeah, obviously, we can fix this in cropping after the fact, but I have a tendency to obsess over it at the time of capture and try to get things just right, for fear of not being able to fix it after the fact, essentially. Another example out in the Palouse, with the fields the wheat having gone golden, getting close to harvest, and these layers of hills, and just trying to find, making sure I'm not cutting anything off in an awkward way. that, if there had been another tree just barely sticking into the frame, or, something along those lines. And then also being really thoughtful about the background. Sometimes you see a subject that's so interesting that it's really easy to get to kind of tunnel vision, essentially, to be focused only on those subjects. This is in the Pyrenees Mountains, and this, funny enough, my wife and I were with a client doing a road trip, and early one morning it was obvious that the light was looking really good. So I'd go look out the window, and he's out there in the parking lot and taking pictures, and he sees me and he kind of motions like, hey, let's go take some pictures, basically. I said, yeah, let's go. And so I leave. My wife's in the room, she's still sleeping, so I leave knowing she'll know that I'm out taking pictures. I lock the door behind me, and we go out there and into the mountains and just find this wonderful little area. And these sheep, well, the sheep by themselves, interesting. The paint, by the way, is the dye is to mark them so that people know whose sheep are whose and they don't mess with them. It does, I feel like, detract a little bit from the photo, but that's what all the sheep look like out there with various colors. But it's more than the sheep. We're in the mountains, and so wanting to make sure that I've got this interesting backdrop as well. So finding the right angle where I can get an interesting mountain peak in the background. Um, by the way, the reason I mentioned the first part of that story is that then I got back, and it turns out that when I locked the door with the key from the outside, my wife had no way of unlocking the door from the inside.
Oh,
So she
no.
was trapped in the hotel room for a couple hours until we got back. So, but we're still married, so worked out okay. But be aware, this would never pass fire code now. But this was an old hotel. This is on the French side of the Pyrenees, and you use the key both on the inside and the outside to lock or unlock the door. So, thankfully now it's all electronic locks. I don't have to worry about that mistake again. But yeah, so just paying attention to the background, the Grand Canyon. So finding an interesting tree and cliff and then juxtaposing it against the background there. I showed a picture of crop duster earlier. It's always such a challenge because crop dusters are in the air and we're on the ground. And so, if they're set up against the sky, that's a lot less interesting. Plus, it doesn't look like they're as low as they really are. And so, anytime that we can get an opportunity to be at an elevated vantage point where, there's this like valley essentially, he's got a spray all the way down that distant hill, going down into the valley and then popping up as he's coming toward us. And so, creating this wonderful backdrop. Well, maybe not wonderful, it's just a wheat field, but creating this nice clean backdrop and one that helps to amplify the fact that the plane is flying relatively low, all things considered. And I mentioned, that I would have another picture of the Space Needle, and I'd made reference to intersections earlier. So intersections, or at least awkward intersections, are when two subjects line up and it just doesn't look right. And this, if you go to Seattle and if you go look at the postcards that are available for sale all over the place, this is the view they're going to show you, and it drives me crazy because all you have to do is move over to the right just a little bit, and there's that gap to the left of the tower that I forget the name of now, but the taller building in the background, you can get the Space Needle over into that nook. And so just by moving over a little bit, we've got the Space Needle in this more, clear space where without that awkward intersection that I think, just works very well. And so being aware when we've got something, the classic example is, the picture of tourists in Paris with the Eiffel Tower growing out of their heads, trying to find ways where that we can line things up to still juxtapose the various objects, the subjects, but without creating these kind of awkward intersections that I know that most people don't notice them, but to me, it takes away from the photo. And again, I mentioned context and my tendency to really zero in on a key subject, and to the detriment of the overall scene, meaning that I sometimes distill it down a little bit too much. So trying to make sure that we're including some degree of context as well. I'm going to show you another picture of the same waterfall taken a different year. This photo was when I was actually just scouting for a photo workshop that I planned to offer in Austria. And so I was just kind of cataloging the various subjects, but we weren't there. in the case of scouting at the right time of year, I just needed photos of, the areas we planned to return to during the workshop. But then during the workshop, we came at a better time, and I wanted to be sure to include context. So here's a picture of the subject. And then the following year, at a better time of year with more water, now we've also got more context. And so we've got boulders in the foreground, a little bit of forest over on the right side, the leading line of the stream exiting the frame. And so it just creates a more interesting sense of contrast. So yes, sometimes I'm distilling things down to, well, like, what's the absolute minimum I need to include in the frame to create an interesting photo. But there are situations where we want to make sure that we're including context. And I think the biggest challenge is feiguring out what is the balance there. How much context do we need to include, for example? I also, and there's various examples. This has been evident if you happen to notice in various of the photos that I've shared, but having some sort of an anchor. This also follows that notion of leading lines, because the anchor has a tendency to be your entryway into the photo, and then you kind of explore visually throughout the rest of the photo. And so, here, the hay bale in the bottom corner, and then that kind of leads us to the hay bale that's roughly at the center of the frame. And then we notice in the fog those in the distance. Or with this stream in Austria, this rock in the foreground. It literally and figuratively gives us this kind of anchor, meaning it's an anchoring element. It has this weight in the corner of the frame, but it also is kind of drawing us in, and then we use that as a jumping off point to explore throughout the rest of the frame. But it just gives us some interesting context for the overall frame as well. I also try to keep an eye out for symmetry. I made reference to my black and white film photography class back in high school many, many years ago. And one of the assignments during that class was repeated shapes. And it's a lesson that stuck, because I do try to keep an eye out for symmetry, for repetition, for repeated shapes and textures. And so here, is it perfectly symmetrical? Far from it. But that's actually kind of, I think, the beauty of it is, so we've got the symmetry, and then the things that aren't exactly symmetrical, windows open versus closed, and, the various differences. But anytime there's some visual symmetry, it has a tendency to work well, to create something that's visually interesting, which in turn means could be an interesting photograph. These columns, actually, one of the things I love about the symmetry here is that it creates this kind of optical illusion. This is in Rome, Italy. And so there's these two columns, or wait, was it one column? I don't know. Is it a column at the center of the frame, or two columns adjacent? And so, it creates this visual illusion where the two columns that are, I'll call them white, the brighter columns, the shadows make it look like another column in between them. And you can kind of have this visual trick, which makes it, I think, a little bit of fun. And just some interesting shapes and textures and light and shadow. This also is at Bethesda Terrace in New York City, in Central Park. Such an easy composition, but a difficult photograph to get, because there's not very much time throughout the day where there's no people on the stairs. You got to get there pretty early in the morning, because by midday there's going to be people sitting on the stairs constantly. And so, but again, that symmetry, the three repeated shapes and the texture of the stairs. And then, another thing I try to do, sometimes it's more obvious than others, but finding unique perspectives. Fisheye lens, that's an easy way to get unique perspectives, because you can't get that view without, that wide angle. And so that can be a lot of fun. But, experimenting, trying different things. And so, I may mention sometimes it doesn't work. This red barn, part of the reason that this photo exists is that I had visited this barn dozens of times, and it's a red barn in a field. There's not a lot to it. It's a pretty simple overall scene. And I would get to the point where it's like, I've been here so many times, I don't really need to photograph it anymore, but the light is wonderful, so I really need to take some pictures, just for my own sake. And so what other interesting ways can I photograph this scene? And so, normally, of course, it would be the barn with something else to supplement it. But here I decided, you know what, let's focus on the wheat, narrow depth of field, and let the barn fall completely out of focus in the background. I liked it. I posted it to, wherever, Instagram or what have you. And I would very often get comments like, the barn should be in focus. And I, in my mind, I wouldn't reply, but in my mind, I would think the whole point is that it's not. But, which doesn't necessarily mean it works. It was a deliberate decision. So I own it. I like it. Maybe nobody else does. But the point is to at least give it a try, to experiment around with different perspectives, different unique interpretations, trying to find scenes that, especially, I love when there's an abstract and you don't even know what you're looking at. And I would tell you what we're looking at, but now I forget the name of it. But this is down by the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan in New York City. It is a train station. It's not. No, I almost got the name, but anyhow, it's like a shopping mall and train station all in one, and it has this interesting architecture. From the outside, to me, it sort of looks like a dinosaur, like what is it, a Stegosaurus skeleton or something. But this is looking inside up at the ceiling. So not straight up, but kind of getting nearly to that. The dark windows there, they form the spine, as it were, the roof line of the building. And so just, finding this unique angle, a unique subject to begin with, but then this unique perspective just by turning the camera upward or going right outside to the World Trade Center. And the building itself is beveled. And so think of it as really, really tall triangles. And on this side, the triangles get narrower as we go to the top. And if we go, just around the corner, so to speak, then meaning if you go to the corner, there it goes from skinny at the bottom, pointed at the bottom, to wider up at the top. And so if you go on the appropriate side, this would be on the north side, right at the base of it, looking straight up, it looks like this vanishing line where the building just kind of disappears up into the sky. And because it's glass or mirrored, it reflects the sky. And so we get this interesting juxtaposition of things just kind of blending in together. And then we have, scenarios where color can essentially be the subject. This will not surprise you, but this is the widest shot I have of this sculpture in Darwin, Australia. That's far away, and I can't even show you what the sculpture really looks like. So this is one of the most common mistakes that I make as a photographer, is I get so caught up with the details, I forget to take that wider view to say, oh, look, it was a bunch of fishing poles painted all these different colors, arranged in this interesting pattern as a sculpture in Darwin, Australia. But the color itself is what can draw you in. And so this is what I came away with in terms of, just primary colors and just enough to illustrate that these were in fact fishing poles. I just missed the context of it. But, it was all about the color is kind of the main point in this context. Similar here, this looks a little artificial, even though this is entirely natural, which is to say that this is the actual water. I'm actually standing in the water. It's right about sunset, late afternoon light anyway, getting pretty close to sunset. This is down toward La Jolla, California. And the color here looks almost unnatural, but it is I guess, like sandstone or whatever the material is, the cliffs, the sandy cliffs reflecting that golden light onto the water. The water reflecting the golden light from the cliffs. And so I ventured out there. I didn't even take off my shoes. That's how how excited I was and how much I was in a hurry to try to make sure that I got it before the color faded. And so from the water toward the shore, getting those colors reflected. But I caught that color, and that's all I needed. It was all about the color. Obviously, some textures there as well. I mentioned the Palouse a few times. So the canola field in the background, and then the wheat field in the foreground juxtaposed. And so just finding a spot where we can get that divided. And it's just color, like the color without the different, if it was all wheat, this would not be a photo. But the fact that it's got the different colors makes it at least a little bit interesting. And then the sort of, I guess, opposite of that, you might say, is where texture is the subject. And for me, what that really means is shadows. And so the difference between light and shadows, so a staircase like this all by itself can be interesting. This is in Italy, back behind the Altar della Patria, the wedding cake as it's referred to, monument. And there's these other buildings to the side, so that in the relatively early hours, you get the shadows of those what amount to roof lines cutting across. the shadows, the light and shadows of the stairs. So it's this kind of double juxtaposition of light and shadows that I thought was interesting. But it is a photo of shadows essentially, and taking that to a little bit of an extreme. A couple examples here. We were in this little town in Spain and wandering around on foot, and I was getting no inspiration whatsoever. I was actually starting to feel like I was not going to take any meaningful pictures in this little town. And then I noticed the shadow and of the sign, and I was like, well, that's pretty interesting. The relatively low light angle, relatively early in the morning, and the shadows cast on the wall, and that kind of the shadow itself was almost the more interesting part of it. It's not amazing, but it was interesting. But then I got a few blocks away and found another sign that in this case was set against a yellow building, and it somehow worked a little bit better. And I focused all the more on just the shadow. It is a picture of a shadow. It happens to include the sign that's causing the shadow. We also, because it's on a corner, well, the building's on a corner, we've got this gradation of the light going around the corner. And, this is one of my favorite pictures. Maybe none of you like it, and I'm okay with that because I like it. And part of it is just I discovered these shadows, and it was just, such a wonderful experience. And a lot of that, for me in photography, a lot of what makes a photo special is that it's preserving what is a great memory for me personally. And that is the inspiration in my photography, is to preserve these sort of, magical moments that I have the opportunity to experience traveling around the world, finding interesting sites. It's just a street sign. And yet it created an interesting view. Part of it was the joy of finding something finally to photograph after having wandered around for a couple hours and not being inspired much at all. But then, and then that joy of discovery, that process of trying to find a way to distill that scene down, to find the right angle from which to photograph the subject to create what hopefully turns into an interesting photo. But again, the most important thing is to practice, even without a camera, just with your eyes out there. And you might even be surprised sometimes at how often you find that you discover a scene. Well, I was gonna say, how many times do you ride around in a taxi? But if you're not in New York City, maybe it's not anywhere near as common. But for me, I lived in New York City for about 9 years, and so taxis were a pretty regular occurrence. And rain was reasonably common, all things considered. And so just like seeing the raindrops, and I thought, you know what? There's a photo here. And so that photo workshop I mentioned, where we had more rain than we really wanted, during one of the times where we had a fair amount of rain, we got Ubers and just basically told them to take us to Upper Manhattan so we could drive through all the streets, and along the way looking for photos of the water droplets on the windows, but juxtaposed with interesting background elements. So just really trying to pay attention. If something catches your eye, it's probably worthy of a photograph. And maybe not in that moment. I might be sitting in my studio and it's not raining now, but if it were, I'd catch the droplets on the window and maybe think, water droplets on windows are pretty cool. What can I do with that? And so again, the more observant you are of everything that's around you, and the more you spend time trying to think about what could I do with that, the more you'll come up with interesting photos along the way. And in fact, part of what brought all of this together for me was there was a music album that had a similar scene, a scene in New York City through glass with water droplets on it. And, that stuck in my mind and was part of what led to eventually this photo being captured. So yeah, by all means, practice, practice, practice. Even just your eyes, just being thoughtful and contemplative out there and think about, what sort of ways might you find more interesting subjects, frame up those subjects more interestingly, find unique perspectives, etc. And with that, I thank you. I'll give you just a very fast reminder if you missed it at the beginning. A couple things coming up, my presentations at the Photoshop Virtual Summit, Project Photoshop. You can learn all about that, get a free pass. Just follow that link there, timgray.me/Project Photoshop will redirect you there. And then my live learning series, so series of presentations, including office hours with Q&A sessions all sorts of good content. So if you'd like to learn more, right now, a series focused on both Lightroom Classic and Photoshop. There will be more in the near future as we wrap up those topics, but you can learn more about that at timgray.me/go live. And with that, I thank you again, and happy to answer any questions that may be there.
Yeah, we've got one that you sort of answered, but we'll ask it again anyhow. Mike asks, I don't know which photo gear you use, but I'm wondering how much you crop, or if you crop at all, with megapixel gear. One can shoot wide and then crop to his liking later. Any thoughts?
Yes, of course. Yes, I have thoughts. Naturally, and as I mentioned earlier, my tendency is to crop in the camera, to try to frame at the time of capture. But I gave that caveat, right? You want to be careful not to crop too much in the camera. Leave yourself a little bit of room. If you've got really high resolution camera, you know that you have that room to crop, that you can shoot a little, you can shoot very wide and then crop and still have an image that can be, for example, printed or displayed at a pretty large size. The thing I would caution you about there, though, is the framing, the juxtaposition. And so, changing your distance to the subject, for example, is going to change the relationship between the various objects through parallax. And so I would say, just make sure that you're framing the scene properly. If you're at the right distance and you're just shooting a little bit wide, then, from a given position, ignoring things like lens distortion, the framing of the scene is going to be the same. If I use a 100mm lens versus a 500mm lens, but I'm standing in exactly the same position, all I've done is literally crop that scene. If I move closer to the subject instead of using a longer lens, now I'm changing the relative relationship. And so I'll get closer to a foreground subject. That subject will appear much larger relative to the background subject. And so it's important to keep that perspective consideration in mind. But otherwise, yes, I caution against being too relaxed about not cropping in the camera. Oh, I've got, 50 megapixels, I can always crop later. It's usually or often worth the effort to get the cropping closer to perfect in the camera, leaving a little bit of space. But yes, acknowledging that by all means. And especially a lot of photographers these days are not printing their images, and you don't need anywhere near as much resolution for a digital display compared to a printed image to get, relatively the same quality. And so, yes, you absolutely can crop, but just don't use it as a crutch, use it as a tool, and make sure that you're optimizing the composition at the time of capture.
Yeah, great. Anybody else have any questions, or any of the attendees? Just drop it either in the chat or in the Q&A. Boy, this is a quiet group today. I think probably because you covered everything so well.
I can hope. I can hope.
Fascinating. And, we have one comment that said, thank you, Tim. I've traveled with you around the world with 90 minutes and learned so much about composition. So
very nice. Thank you very much.
You've certainly traveled the globe here and brought a lot of interesting ideas and things to make you think a little bit more on taking photos.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, great.
But you don't have to travel far to get great photos. You can find them in your own backyard.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff close by, and you always forget about that sometimes.
Right.
No, yeah. Well, Tim, thank you. It was great. I appreciate. I've been hoping to get you on, and now you exceeded my expectations. So
thank you very
much. Canned food.
And like I said, please, people should sign up for the.
They have their greenies.
Okay.
People should sign up for your e-newsletter. There's so many great tips in that newsletter.
He's following you.
I know.
All the time. So it's definitely worth getting. I don't know how you manage to do it. That's daily, right?
every weekday anyway. Yeah.
Every weekday.
It's coming up. Yeah, November will be 25 years that I've been publishing this Ask Tim Gray. You can go to asktimgray.com, by the way, and there's a field there if you want to sign up for it. and it's a daily question and answer email where I answer questions from photographers. When I first started it almost 25 years ago, in my mind, I would have gotten to the point where I would have answered every question that there was, and I would just publish them on a website so you could just go look them up. Obviously, that was absurd
Yeah.
because I'm still not gonna. I don't think I'm gonna run out of questions anytime soon. So yeah, I think it's a really good way. I'll tell you, these days the tendency is for a good percentage of the questions to relate to Lightroom Classic because that's what a lot of photographers are focused on and learning right now. But it's open, I get questions on Photoshop and photography gear and composition and all sorts of other things. But yeah, so asktimgray.com is it's the blog, so you can just go there and read back on past posts, but you can also sign up if you want to get those daily emails.
Yeah, it's always, I always find it interesting to read it every day, and a lot of the stuff I sort of know. Some of it was oh, hey, that's a good tip to remember. And I've
Right.
had other people say, "Have you seen this tip?" And I said, "Yeah, I've seen it." And Tim's always seems to have the answer with two complicated programs, Photoshop and Lightroom.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, there's never going to be an end with the way they've made those two
Exactly.
programs.
Well, and Adobe keeps changing them anyway, so
Yeah,
introducing new
yeah.
questions along the way.
So it's amazing. I love what Adobe has done with the programs. They've made it both easier and harder to do things, but
Right.
it's I had somebody mention, I wonder when they're going to just make Lightroom Classic into a Lightroom Classic Photoshop all in one program.
And in fact, I talked about that in a recent Ask Tim Gray email newsletter, and the question was, when is Photoshop going to be discontinued, essentially? And so I decided to have a little bit of fun with it, and I forget the exact year now off the top of my head, but it was something like uh, February 17th, 2031, maybe somewhere in there. Don't quote me on the exact date. The point is that in my answer, I gave a specific date of when Photoshop would cease to exist, but quickly added that that was just my tongue-in-cheek way of saying that, that things are changing and that increasingly Lightroom Classic and by extension Camera Raw are getting so much more sophisticated that there's less and less need for photographers to use Photoshop. And
Yeah.
so I think of it not so much as Photoshop is going to be discontinued, but that among photographers, and I kind of think of this based on version numbers of Lightroom. With the first version of Lightroom, 100% of photographers still needed Photoshop. And then by the time we got to like Lightroom version 6, let's say half of photographers had basically stopped using Photoshop. Now we're probably at the point where like maybe 75% of photographers rarely, if ever, use Photoshop because Lightroom Classic does what they need. That'll continue to shift over
Yeah.
time. I don't actually think Adobe will discontinue Photoshop anytime soon, but obviously it's a changing landscape in terms of what photographers need as far as the software for
Yeah.
managing their workflow.
Yeah. It's amazing how much it's changed and how
For
little I
sure.
end up going to Photoshop until I need to do something very specific that only Photoshop can do. And
Exactly.
it's so, yeah, I expect it will always probably be there, but yeah,
Yeah.
I
And
I
part of the
mean,
challenge, yeah, part of the challenge
people,
for photographers is that there's less and less need for Photoshop, but
yeah,
Photoshop is wildly complex. And so that introduces a really unique problem for photographers in that now you don't need Photoshop very often, but when you do, there's a risk you're going to feel lost, right? Because it is
yeah.
more complicated. It's not as, sort of user discoverable as Lightroom Classic is, for example. So that introduces a new challenge. But yeah, Photoshop still is much more powerful when it comes to applying targeted adjustments, creating composite images, applying creative effects, to some extent, image cleanup, where it just has more flex. You have more direct control at the pixel level with Photoshop, and so it still has a place in the toolbox for the photographer. It's just that an increasing number of photographers either, don't really need it or don't need it anywhere near as often as they used to, which is, a little bit of a mixed bag, as I mentioned.
Yeah, yeah. yeah, we've got one person that says I use Photoshop for compositing. I photograph with people,
Yep.
and yeah, stuff like that, and yeah, doing text and things like that. That's where I
Yeah,
end up
exactly.
using it, where I'm putting together a promotion piece and I need to add text and everything. That's
For sure.
still going to be Photoshop. I don't see them adding that into Lightroom anytime soon, but
Nor do I.
uh,
Yeah.
it's but yeah, there are days when I go into Photoshop and I go, oh, how do you do that now?
Yeah, where was that? Exactly.
I know
Yes,
it's
all the more
there, but
probably
not
practice.
sure where.
Even if you don't think you need Photoshop too much, you might want to keep practicing just so that when you really need it, you'll remember,
Yep.
what it is you need to do.
Yeah, yeah, because it is such a versatile
For
program
sure.
that I have
Absolutely.
yet to find anything that comes close to what Photoshop does.
Well, and one of the things I always say is if you can imagine it, you can create it in Photoshop.
Yeah,
You have
yeah,
the tools are there. It might be difficult to figure out, a little complicated, but you can do
yep,
it.
yeah. No, and I'm amazed at even though I've used it since Photoshop 3 came out, and I don't know what iteration we're really at anymore, the way
Right.
they've changed things, but I've been doing it for years, and I'm still amazed at what some people can show me what they can do with it, and it
Right.
makes me sometimes feel like an amateur. Go, oh, I never thought of using it for that or doing that. But
Right.
yeah, it's just yeah, they're both great programs, and I'll
Absolutely.
never give them up as long
Right.
as I can afford them.
Exactly.
So, let's see. Just trying to think. Yeah, masking is the key in Photoshop. Yes, masking is pretty good in Photoshop, although Lightroom's masking is really coming along
Yeah, and
quite
the way I
well.
would describe it is that masking in Lightroom Classic is much, much easier, but more limited. And in Photoshop, you can literally edit the masks down to the pixel level. You've
Yeah,
got much more powerful selection tools in Photoshop. So, Lightroom keeps getting better and better in terms of masking, and especially some of the automatic masks and AI masks. But Photoshop, is absolutely more powerful in Photoshop. Masking in Photoshop, you've got complete control. It can be a lot of
yeah,
work, but you got complete
yep,
control.
yeah. It's and I've gone through that with some of the stuff that I do. It's yeah, it's I
Absolutely.
still go to Photoshop for the fancy masks and
Right.
um, dropping out backgrounds has just been so easy with Photoshop uh, these
Certainly.
days.
Yeah.
Gotten a lot better than what it was in Photoshop 3, that's for
Yeah, right.
sure. But then that was back in the film days, so
Also, yeah, exactly.
man. Okay, any other questions, comments before we let Tim go? Uh Great. Well, Tim, thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having
We'll
me.
be in touch with possibly some having you back for some other talks because
Absolutely.
I enjoy having you, and I do want to one of these days. We don't talk about Photoshop and Lightroom quite as much. Unfortunately, we try to keep everything varied, so we do a lot of On1 and Luminar and some of that, but I
Right.
feel we need to get back into more Lightroom and Photoshop.
Sure.
The guy that normally works with me, he is anti-Adobe. He hates subscription models. So I have a hard time. That part of the reason why he didn't show up today was he thought, oh, this might be a lot of Photoshop and Lightroom, and
Right.
he doesn't like either one of those programs. So
Right. Right.
we got a few of those, and I've gotten off the track of not talking, I think, enough about Photoshop and Lightroom
Right.
because they are such good programs. And
Sure. No, happy to come back and talk about those.
we'll have to bring it back because I know there's a lot of people that would love to learn more about
Right.
both either one of those programs
Yeah, be my
and
pleasure.
such. So great. Well, thanks for spending your Saturday morning with us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Certainly appreciate it, and
Thanks for having me.
we'll continue on.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.
Thank you, Tim.
Anybody got anything else you'd like to talk about before we call it a day? That was a great session. I've wanted to get Tim on and never thought we could afford to do it. And with the help of Hunt's Photo and Video and Gary, um, made him a little more affordable for us to be able to bring on, and hope to bring him on more just to talk about Lightroom or Photoshop, some of the more technical stuff that he's such an expert at. So, but so any other exciting stuff? This is a quiet group today. We had quite a few watching, so that's always good. I should say, let's see, next month I have, let me get to it here. So I think next month we have Jeff Engel in September, who's just freshly back. Yeah, September, I've got Jeff Engel. He's going to talk about bird photography, probably a little bit about African safaris. He just came back from Africa yesterday, from what I hear. So he needs me to help him get all this stuff transferred into his main Lightroom. In October, we got Simon Tolsman with Life is a Highway, talking about car photography. In November, I've got Brian Hansel coming on. I have to get back to him to see what he wants to talk about. Pardon me. January, we've got Hazel Meredith on Photoshop Potpourri. February, we've got Mark Batista, composition, shooting with intent. And March, we have Chris Nicholson photographing in national parks. That should be a pretty good one as well, getting ready for next summer for shooting in parks. April, we have Mike Mazul, finding composition in nature. And in May, we got Joe and Marie Rakosi, Yellowstone in winter. June and July, or June, I'm still working on. I'm waiting to hear back from a couple people. July, I've got Ian Plant on the visual design techniques. So we got a pretty good lineup coming, pretty much, except for June and August, and they'll put me a year out. So I'm pretty happy with a lot of that. Always looking for new speakers. So if somebody sees somebody that's good, please let me know and I will check into them. We've had a couple that people have suggested. I'm finding there's a lot of them aren't talking to groups as much anymore. They just want to put on their own programs and such. So that gets a little frustrating on a few of them, but there's a lot of photographers out there and a lot of new guys coming on the scene. So we'll keep talking about that. And if there's a specific subject you'd like to have us work on, we'll keep doing that as well. I'm trying to get a variety of different subjects out there to talk about. And I do plan on bringing in more people on Photoshop and Lightroom. We've been a little light on that lately. I know I've got Hazel coming in January, but Photoshop and Lightroom are changing so fast and they can do so much that it's probably time to jump into that a little more. Yeah, I can try to get some people on street photography. There was one or two that I know about. We'll see about that. So yeah, but boy, quiet group today. I don't have Marty to come and talk and fill in some of the stuff. So it happens when he has to work.
Yeah, my biggest digital problem is dealing with all these robocalls I'm getting from a town called Shamo, Wisconsin, and
Huh,
I'm getting 20 calls a day, and it's all about Medicare Part D crap,
yeah,
I
yeah.
just don't know what there is there any. I've been looking for an app or a solution to say I want to block the whole dang area code, but I haven't found one yet. So
Yeah,
because they keep computer generating different numbers all the time, I'm
right.
guessing that's what
They
they're doing.
constantly do it. I use my T-Mobile phone has an app in it that they have that blocks a lot of the scam callers, and it tells me if it's a scam, so I know whether I need to answer it or not.
Yeah,
If
I'm just
if
letting
you,
them ring now. I answered
yeah,
one of them. I answered one of them just to see what it was all about, and man, they stepped me through about 5 or 6 different layers. And I was talking to some guy who sounded like he was from India at the end there,
yeah,
and he was going to transfer me again. I said, "So forget it. Take me off your call list." But apparently, I'm not. They
that
don't do that anymore. So
that never does it. What I've done with the Medicare people is I tell them I'm only 49, and that seems to knock you off the list really quick because they go, well, he's not worth calling anymore.
yeah, yeah.
But
It's just aggravating. I know.
yeah,
I've been tempted to write my legislators and say, "What can we do about this crap, you guys? You're always talking about what you're going to do for us, and this
yeah.
would be a
Well, and
very
there's
because
the
I'm not
no
the only
call
one that's getting
list.
it." So
Yeah, it's there's the no call list, but nobody follows those rules because there's
no
nothing ever.
enforcement.
When they shut them down, they just start another one up with another set of phone numbers, so nobody can actually
No.
catch them doing half this stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I just let the phone ring. If I don't recognize the number, I just let it go to voicemail. If they want to leave me a voicemail, then it may be somebody that's worth calling back.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, that's what I've been doing, but I'm still getting 20 calls a day. It's
That's a
unreal.
lot. That's a
I
lot.
th
yeah,
I think I've
yeah.
had 5 this morning already, so
Wow.
it's just
I've been get.
aggravating.
I'm only getting 2 or 3, but like I I leave most of them go like Ken does to
Yeah.
voicemail, and it usually doesn't. And then the 1 or 2 that I've answered where I thought it might be somebody I need to answer a call on, and it's the same thing. Like I said, I tell them that I'm young and I don't uh, need it, and that seems to cut them back quite a ways
Hmm.
because they put it in their system. The other one I've been getting lately is one for taxes. Way to cut back on your taxes, and
Oh
I
yeah.
haven't figured out a good answer to that one yet. But
Yeah.
I've given up answering a lot of those phone calls.
Mm.
It's hard though. I run a business with my phone, so I sometimes I need to answer them. But my T-Mobile is pretty good at saying that it's a scam call when it comes through.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. I just think
but
there ought to be some intuitive app builder that would come up with an app where you could block a whole area code because they're coming all from the one same area code type of thing.
yeah,
But
you can start blocking them, but yeah, like you said, they come from a lot of different phone numbers, so not a whole
uh,
lot you can end up
uh,
doing.
that's my only digital complaint, other than the cost of SSD cards. I noticed they did come down a little bit. The
Yeah,
4 TB
yeah,
did come down a little, but they're still up there sky high again still.
yeah. I look and I've got a bunch of these 1 and 2 terabyte SSDs, and I think the last one I bought, I paid like $149, and I see now they're $249 for the same one.
Yeah.
So I wish they'd come down because I wouldn't mind getting a couple more, but
Yeah.
because they run so fast. But
Yeah, especially that's where I have all my photos is on my I have two 4 TB SSD cards by Samsung. Uh, it is much quicker than what it used to be, that's for sure. So,
yeah, yeah. No, I run all my original photos on an SSD card, and then I transfer them to a hard drive, regular hard drive later
mhm.
when I'm done with them, pretty
The
much.
spin drive.
Yep.
You still using
'Cause
spare
there's-
drives? Okay.
Yeah, they're still cheap enough, and I run 14 of them, so I got
Wow.
14 drives going.
Yeah.
So, but
Okay.
I've got a lot of them are video stuff that I archive. So,
Okay.
but
Well, thanks.
no
Let me
problem.
just let off my steam a little bit.
Yeah, well, somebody ever comes up with an answer. I don't know if anybody knows, but I've got a customer that's got a film camera, a Nikon F3, that he wants to keep using, but it's not working right. Does anybody know anybody that can repair them? I'm gonna. I don't think Nikon can go back that far on those old cameras and repair them. So I think it needs to be an old camera repair place. But
There used to be a place in Chicago called Chicago Cameras. It's
okay.
been years ago. I know when I had my Mamiya's twin lenses, that's where I sent them to have work done, but it's been several years ago. So
Yeah, that's
I
I
don't know
think
if they're
what I
still
need
not.
to find the guy is an older repair place. Because I got to admit, I'm actually trying to buy an old Nikon F3 for my collection because I had one and I got rid of it. I wish I wouldn't have. It's
Yeah.
a really nice film camera,
Yeah.
and it would go with my D3 for the digital version. But
I have a friend out in California. He says he's got 3 F3s still in the box. He bought them whenever eons ago, and
wow.
he's never taken them out of the box. And I said, "Well, what are you storing them for?" He said, "Oh, I don't know. I just don't want to get rid of them." I said, "Well, good gravy." I
He
thought
could
I,
get
wa- I,
some,
I thought I was a hoarder. Yeah,
yeah, he could get good money for those cameras.
because they're new. I mean, he's never even taken them out of the boxes. So,
Yeah,
oh, well.
man, that's
I
nice.
take my Nikons to a place called Authorized Photo Service um,
Okay,
in Niles. It's right next to Chicago, north side.
sure,
It's convenient for me because it's only a few miles away from where we live
right.
in Park Ridge. But I have a phone number, but it's called Authorized Photo Service. The phone number is 847-966-4091. And they have repair services and they do cleaning and everything, and they're pretty good.
Okay,
If they wouldn't be
great.
able to fix the Nikon F3, they might be able to recommend somebody who could.
Yeah. And it could just need a cleaning. I mean, it's an old enough camera. He thinks it's something in the shutter button. He's tried new batteries. It works mechanically on the mechanical side. It's got a 90th of a second that it fires at, but the camera won't turn on even with new batteries. And
Hmm.
he's tried everything and all the suggestions that I had for him, but he's thinking it's in the shutter button itself that might be the problem.
Mhm.
Or it could be the switch in the advance, because that's where the switch was in those cameras, was in the advance lever. Pulled it out and it turned it on. So oh yeah, I'll send that to him. There's got to be somebody still repairing them because there's enough people. eBay sells tons of them. They've gotten down in price. They're down to about $450 for an F3. But I guess people are still shooting with them. I've been shooting with my old Nikon F, so or actually my Nichromat EL that I have. Sort of weird shooting with film and knowing you only got 36 shots to be able to shoot
Mhm.
and manually focusing a camera. You got to remember to focus.
And
But
you're not getting instant gratification of
no,
seeing
you have
what you
no
took.
clue what you're getting. But it's sort of interesting to shoot that way and going from digital to a film camera, knowing you only get 36 shots. It makes you think on every shot on how you want to compose it and how you want to shoot it and hope that you got something that works on. Now I got to get the film processed, and that's a whole nother story. Fortunately, Allied Digital Photo in Germantown still processes film, but And I think Mike Crivello still does film as well here in Brookfield, but yeah, you want to try something different, go back to film for a little bit and see what it's like to shoot just 36 shots. It's sort of an interesting feeling. And they're heavy, but boy, there's nothing like that mechanical sound of a mechanical camera advancing the film and taking the shot and the clunk that they make over the new electronic cameras that just have a fake shutter sound when they go off. But sort of interesting and fun. Anything else from anybody? Otherwise, we can call it a day. Everybody can go outside. It's what 74 degrees. Not a bad day today. Not going to be a nice weather weekend. We have still got 4 people watching on YouTube, and we had 39 people watching today. So we had a good number of people to see Tim. So I guess with that, we'll call it a day, and we'll see everybody next month for Jeff Engel and his composition on bird photography and bird and African safari stuff. So
Thanks a lot, Jeff, for all your efforts.
all right,
Appreciate it.
Thanks everybody, and everybody have a nice day, and we'll see you in September.